I'm Xavier, and welcome to the Danger Room. Once again, none of the animals you'll see here are dangerous. In the last video, I introduced you to two of the smallest herps in Ontario, the spring peeper and the Decay's brown snake. Today, we'll be sticking to amphibians and meeting some very common, though rarely seen species. As a quick hint, each of the three species we'll cover has spots that are, respectively, red, yellow, and blue. Now, these animals aren't dangerous per se, but they are poisonous, the caveat being that this is only an issue if you were to ingest the animal. As long as you don't eat your pets and wash your hands before and after handling, they're perfectly safe. But let's jump right in. This 20-gallon long aquarium is designed to mimic a creek runoff. In fact, it's inspired by a Serpa design, the Forest Runoff Creek Terrarium. The tank itself was a Value Village find a few years ago. Using black lava rock and polyurethane foam for the structure, I built a waterfall with slate pieces to form an incline. I should note this actually took 3 attempts to make, as the previous 2 iterations were just plain awful in my opinion. It sits on garden foam blocks, with a raised egg crate false bottom forming the rest of the base, which I then filled around with pebbles and leca, and topped with a layer of weed control fabric before adding my standard terrarium soil blend. I added a larger piece of driftwood I had on hand to mimic the appearance of a fallen tree. The waterfall outflow is formed from 4 pieces of extruded plastic and silicone together to house a submersible pump. I also cut a 5th piece to act as a lid and to prevent any inhabitants from crawling in and getting trapped. I covered it in silicone and pressed in ground lava rock, and repeated this process for the other outward-facing portions. A few pieces of vinyl tube and a connector complete the outflow. The tank is planted with various local mosses, as well as a few cuttings of arrowhead, white and red vein Photonia, spider plant, peace lily, and sword fern. I should note that the moss has begun to yellow in some places, and I'm looking to refresh the tank soon after I address some overarching layout issues in the room. The tank is designed as a terrarium with a water feature, while still not being a true paludarium as there's no permanent body of water, and it was of course made with terrestrial amphibians in mind. This tank is also a mixed species setup, housing a small group each of spotted salamanders and blue spotted salamanders. There's about 3 of each group, but I can't confirm as it's been quite a while since I've seen them out and about. Salamanders are my favorite group of amphibians, though I'll admit they're not necessarily the best choice for most people. In terms of display alone, they can be boring. I rarely see them unless I happen to come down here at night, and even then, usually just 1, maybe 2 at a time. They typically keep to themselves and have some areas in the tank they usually stick to, though I find they tend to move, seemingly migrating to new locations that they then stick to for extended periods of time, before ultimately repeating the process. I should also acknowledge that housing different species together is itself a controversial subject, and I don't recommend doing so without doing your own thorough research, and even then, proceed with caution. Animals that can be housed together can often come with their own restrictions. Housing multiple males, for example, can often be a big no-no. Multi-species mixes can be further complicated due to territorial responses, if they, say, occupy a similar environmental niche, or the possibility of predation. You don't want to put 2 animals in and wake up to only find 1 left. In this case, I was comfortable doing so as these species can often be found together in the wild, to which I can personally attest from my own experience. This past summer, for instance, I found 3 different amphibian species together under the same log. Spotted and blue spotted salamanders, though of different species, belong to the same group of mole salamanders, possessing robust bodies and limbs adept at digging holes, as the name would suggest. This is also why they're rarely seen in the wild, or in their enclosure, as the case may be. The adults only enter water to lay their eggs, but are otherwise fully terrestrial, and largely fossorial. Once the aquatic larvae metamorphose and leave the water as air-breathing terrestrial adults, they seek ground cover and will burrow under fallen logs, wood debris, and large stones, usually only being found when you flip such objects over, though also found during and after rainy periods as they migrate throughout their range. Like most amphibians, they'll feed on most things that fit in their mouths, usually smaller terrestrial invertebrates such as slugs, worms, grubs, and spiders. Zooming out for a moment, this tank is topped with a DIY window screen lid. You absolutely need a lid for salamanders, even burrowing mole salamanders. Though they prefer to hide, I've actually seen them climb to any available elevation. If the land portion of their environment rises, they'll rise with it, even to the top of the tank. I've also observed them climb on top of the log and other elements from time to time. In short, never underestimate their climbing ability. Salamanders don't necessarily know that they're salamanders. The lighting setup is a single T8 LED bulb and fixture, which was itself another markdown thrift find. In its original life, it was a decorative Halloween blacklight, but it fits regular bulbs just fine too, and I find is enough to allow for plant growth without stimulating too much algae growth in the waterfall, which was a problem with the stronger light I used previously. Moving now to the other side of the room is another amphibian setup, in this case a 50-gallon riparium for my eastern newts. For those unfamiliar with the difference, newts are an aquatic salamander species, and are unique among amphibians. Most species of frogs, toads, and salamanders lay eggs in the water, which hatch into fully aquatic tadpoles or larvae, which then, over time, grow limbs, lungs, lose their gills, and leave the water to live on land, with frogs typically remaining close to the water, whereas toads and salamanders move further out to surrounding fields and forests, and only return to water to mate, lay eggs, and restart the process. Newts largely adhere to this template, but with an additional step. Once the aquatic larvae develop, they leave the water not as fully developed adults, but as juveniles, called efts. They look largely like the adults, but smaller, with a rounded conical tail, and, in the case of eastern newts, are a distinct and noticeably redder color, hence the name red eft. They remain on land as efts for varying lengths of time, depending on the species and location, but typically 1 to 3 years for eastern newts, at which time their bodies complete their metamorphosis. Their coloration dulls to a more rusty shade, ultimately settling to a brown or greenish color. Their tails flatten out to a paddle shape, and their dry, rough skin, which is similar in nature to a toad's, begins to secrete mucus and becomes slimier and more like that of a frog. They then return to the water to mate and lay eggs, and then remain in the water as aquatic adults, though they do still breathe air and must surface to take a breath. The tank itself was designed to be primarily aquatic, with limited land area that would not need to hold substrate, with riparian growth forming the land cover. It's also been drilled for a Penplack 700 canister filter. The background is a sheet of styrofoam silicone to the glass, and then covered with spray foam, which itself was then carved and coated in cement, painted with acrylic paint, and coated with a layer of epoxy. While I'm not the biggest fan of the shiny appearance, the epoxy was added to minimize the leaching of minerals into the water, which can alter the pH and cause issues for animals. It also helps minimize algae buildup on the background. I originally had this tank running without the epoxy, and previously I found both those things to be an issue. After moving, while the newts were still in a temporary home for transport purposes, I took the opportunity to address that issue. During the initial build, various driftwood branches and log pieces were embedded into the foam, providing the strongest possible support once set. Various plants were placed or wedged in and around these wood pieces, with their roots growing down into the water and providing additional cover for the inhabitants. The substrate is just play sand, though I first placed a few bags filled with terrarium substrate, which added topography once covered by the sand, and to provide nourishment for any aquatic plants. On that note, and as you can see, the aquatic plants are quite sparse at the moment. I should address that there used to be more, but many died off after we moved, and I haven't been able to replace them. I certainly want to have this tank planted much more, as newts can become territorial and benefit from as much aquatic coverage as possible. For those who might be wondering why even bother with a land area, it's because newts do regularly leave the water and require a haul-out area to rest and dry off when needed. In fact, I regularly see them climbing onto branches and even up plants. For anyone looking to keep any sort of newt, a secure lid is critical. Unfortunately, I've learned the hard way over time that newts often seem to think of themselves as geckos, climbing anything available, including the glass itself at times. Speaking of the glass, the tank was a recovery, part of a pair of tanks a neighbor was getting rid of a number of years ago. Thankfully, my parents were able to keep them in their shed until I moved out and took them with me. These are older tanks made from thicker glass than you might normally encounter, and as you'd expect, are quite heavy. This one's been enhanced as I removed the front pane, which was etched, and replaced it with a clearer piece of a matching size. I then built a rim using aquarium trim recovered from yet another tank, to ensure there'd be no bowing that might eventually threaten the tank's integrity. There's no other tank currently underneath, as I'm in the process of building a new set of stands, which should hopefully be showcased in a later video. That wraps things up for this installment. Thank you for joining me for part 2 of the series. Once again, all of the builds you're seeing were completed prior to the channel's inception, but going forward I do hope to bring you step-by-step tutorials. Please let me know if you'd be interested in that type of content by liking and sharing the channel. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and find your X Factor.